Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Science in a Snap. I am your host, Claire Teagan. Today we will be talking about twins and their genetics. I have brought in a special guest. She is the child of two identical twins from different families. Her father's twin brother and her mother's twin sister also married each other and had a child. Our special guest is Izzy Arthur. Welcome, Izzy. So nice to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Izzy, how is it having your aunt and uncle identical to your parents? Do you ever get them confused?
Oh yeah, it's crazy. I get confused all the time. I used to be able to not even tell them apart, but I'm getting a lot better at it.
So your aunt and uncle have a daughter about the same age as you. Do you guys look alike?
Well, we look more like siblings than cousins, but we aren't identical.
Is it possible for your parents and your aunt and uncle to each have a child that was identical to their cousin?
It is possible, but extremely unlikely.
Can you explain to me in detail why it is unlikely?
Yes, but before I tell you why, I need to explain the basics of genetics. So first, I'll tell you about the structure of a cell. Each cell has a nucleus. The nucleus is the control center of the cell. The genes play a very important role in the cell. They have the instructions for the proteins, which are the things that make up your DNA. Proteins are then carried by chromosomes and passed to your child. A gene is the basic physical and functional unit of heredity. Genes, which are made up of DNA, act as instructions to make molecules called proteins. In humans, genes vary in sizes, from a few hundred DNA bases to more than 2 million bases.
That's very interesting, but what does hereditary mean, and what is DNA?
Heredity is the passing on of physical or mental characteristics, genetically from one generation to another. Now I'll tell you what DNA is. Deoxyribonucleic acid is a molecule that carries the genetic instructions used in growth, development, functioning, and reproduction of all known living organisms and many viruses.
Wow, that's so cool. So explain to me why you and your cousin aren't identical.
Well, each parent will pass on to you a gene to make up your genotype. Your genotype is the genes that give you your trait. The physical trait is called a phenotype.
This is getting confusing. What do you mean?
Here, I'll give you an example. Having freckles is the dominant trait that will give you the capital letter of F. And not having freckles is the recessive trait, for example, lowercase f. Each person has two letters. For example, your mom could have capital F and a lowercase f, which means she would have freckles because the capital F is the dominant. A child gets one letter from each parent, chosen at random. The only way to not have freckles would be to get two lowercase f's, which would be called homozygous, because both of the letters are the same. However, if the letters were different, then it would be called heterozygous.
Okay, thanks. Now I have a better understanding. So you're saying if my parents both had freckles, I could still possibly not get freckles if I got a recessive gene from each of them?
Yes, that is correct. But because the trait of not having freckles is recessive, the chances of you getting it are a lot smaller than having freckles.
So even if your parents and your aunt and uncle are twins, the chances of you and your cousin being identical are very, very slim because there are so many possible trait combinations.
Exactly. Because the traits are chosen at random, it will be almost impossible for me and my cousin to be identical. In fact, even though identical twins are from the same egg, they aren't exactly identical because they have different fingerprints and traits that are affected by the environment, such as moles.
Wow, I had no idea. That was very interesting to hear from you, Izzy. Thank you so much for coming on our show. I definitely learned a lot about genetics, and I'm sure our listeners did too.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad you learned something new.
Make sure to tune in next week for our next podcast on the biology of a frog.
Ribbit, ribbit.